Good afternoon to everybody. Just want to make sure that we're all in place. There are a couple of people who indicated that traffic has kept them back a bit, but we are going to go ahead and begin. So thank you very much, and I'll turn over now to Prime Minister for her opening remarks before the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you who are sitting at the back, please feel free to come to the table if you wish. Good afternoon, all, and let me say, we're ready, members of the media? Thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. Over the course of the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've had a series of engagements and encounters between the Board of the National Insurance Scheme and different members of the country, from the social partnership, private sector, members of the labor movement, Barbados Association of Retired Persons, members of parliament, previous board members and board chairman, members of the Barbados Christian Council and the Barbados Evangelical Association, members of all of the political parties. It is now the time for us to speak with the people of Barbados. And this afternoon, this session has been called for us to speak as one family with respect to the current state and future outlook of the National Insurance Fund. This is not the first time this country has had to face moments such as this. Indeed, in a previous life, I was there as Attorney General when the then Prime Minister, Mr. Owen Arthur, led a team of people with the National Insurance Board in order to be able to talk the country through the difficulties and challenges that the National Insurance Fund and the National Insurance Scheme generally were facing in the country. We are at a similar moment in time. At this point, therefore, I'd like to invite the actuary of the National Insurance Board, Mr. Derek Osborne, and thereafter its deputy chairman of the board, Mr. Rawdon Adams, to be able to address the people of the country. And then we will be passing over to all of us as stakeholders, Ms. Tricia Tanis, of the Barbados Private Sector Association, the General Secretary of the Barbados Workers' Union, Ms. Tony Moore, and the General Secretary of the National Union of Public Workers, Richard Green, and then, of course, Mr. Dr. Nigel Taylor, President of the Barbados Evangelical Association, Barbados Christian Council, Reverend Horsford, and then the political parties. I have an apologies for Bishop Atherley, who is not able to make it this afternoon for personal reasons, but other than that, he would have also been briefed already, and Dr. Ronnie Yearwood, the President of the Democratic Labour Party, will also address us this afternoon. So I would like to pause now and to invite Mr. Derek Osborne to carry the country through the perspective that he has shared with us, which was shared with me in the month of June. And since then, the end of June, since then, those meetings that I referred to have been taking place. Mr. Osborne, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Barbados. It's really a pleasure to be with you to talk about this most important institution we've come to know and love, the National Insurance Scheme. And the focus today is on the National Insurance Fund, even though the report that we've just tabled in Parliament last night was the 17th actuarial review of the National Insurance Fund, the Severance Fund, and the Unemployment Fund. Every 3 years, the National Insurance Act requires that an actuary be engaged to look at the fund and assess its future and determine whether or not on its current path it's able to meet the promises that are made. If we think about the promises that NIS makes, the 25-year-old who just started working is looking forward to 42 years of coverage as an employee, sickness benefit, maternity benefit, employment injury benefits, And then when they turn 67, they're looking forward to a lifetime pension, another 20 years, at least 25 years thereafter. So it's really a long-term promise that the NIS makes to workers and eventual pensioners. And it's important, therefore, that the government and the board know at periodic intervals how well the fund is at today's date and what the outlook looks like. And as we start, let's talk about first why the national insurance is important and exactly what the objectives are. So 2 months ago, the NIS celebrated 55 years of existence. Early June 1967 was the start date. The ILO came to the Caribbean in the early 60s, and they implemented these schemes, Guyana, Jamaica, and then Barbados. And for the most part, the scheme looks very similar to how it looked 55 years ago. And there are certain objectives that the fund seeks to achieve and at the same time should seek to avoid. Right? And what we have here is a single statement that we believe calculates succinctly what the objectives and what the main goals of the fund are. And that is a comprehensive system of social protection that reflects Barbados' value system, not the ILO's value system or anyone else's value system, but Barbados' value system. It responds to changing conditions in society, the economy, demographics, and at the end of the day, every single day, it satisfies our customers' needs. So what we have is a comprehensive system that changes with the times, and it represents Barbados' value systems. And when we look at a system, we look at these three things to assess the adequacy of benefits, the affordability of contributions, and the sustainability of the fund going forward. And if we think about benefit programs, those people who are receiving typically always want more. The challenge there is that they come with a cost. And every time we increase benefits, we also then have to look about how we're going to pay for those benefits down the road. And so adequacy of benefits and affordability for the employers, and the workers are conflicting priorities for the most part. And then, as I mentioned earlier about the long-term promise, we must think about our children and grandchildren and the ability to meet that promise when it's their turn to get, and hopefully not have them pay more in contributions and get less in benefits than prior generations did. On the side of trying to avoid, we mainly are concerned about the fund being depleted. For many years, actuaries have said the projections, and not only Barbados, across the region, in the US, projections have been made of these systems that show that unless they're reformed, they could be depleted within a generation. And that's the worst case scenario for the NIS. The other side, though, is that we also want to ensure that those people who should contribute and therefore qualify for pension in old age do so. What we have is a challenge where we have a lot of self-employed people, informal sector workers, who are a growing group in society, who are not contributing, and therefore may not qualify for pension when they get older, and they may become a burden for their children, for their neighbors, for the community, and probably for the government as well. And so the challenges are both financial and social, and we have to find a way to balance them both. In 2003, 2004, the then government embarked on a reform exercise for the NIS, and many changes were made back then. The contribution rate was increased from about 14% to 18%. The pension age for full pension was increased from 65 to 67, and benefits were made slightly less generous. Unfortunately, however, the last 18 years have been challenged. Some economic cycles have not been good to the NIS, not been good to Barbados. And what we have, first of all, is the population is now declining. So starting in 2017, there have been more deaths each year than there have been births. So what we call the natural increase of the population is now negative. We believe that migration outward continues, and so the population is now lower than it was 5 years ago and lower than it was 10 years ago. Again, for economic reasons, employment levels have come down. There are about 9,000 fewer workers before COVID started than they were 10 years prior. Right? So we have declining populations, declining employment base. The economy over the last 13 years, 9 of those 13 years saw negative growth. Average real GDP growth in that period was barely positive over the entire period. And in tune, so as the economy has not grown with more labor and higher wages, we see that the number of employed persons, based on the surveys done by the Statistical Service Department, and then NIS compliance and the contributions to NIS, we see declining in both of those areas. We also had debt restructuring. So in 2018, the government saw it necessary to reduce its debt obligations, and like other bondholders, the National Insurance Fund lost some of its assets, in this case just over $1 billion. But when we look at the NIS and investments it makes in Barbados, we have to make sure we consider closely the fact that the contributors to the NIS, which are employers and workers, are the same essential contributors to government tax revenue, employers and workers. And so when government decided to have a haircut on its bonds and the NIS lost $1 billion, yes, NIS books, the assets were reduced by $1 billion, but government's obligation to NIS also was reduced by $1 billion. And in so doing, future taxpayers were saved $1 billion. And so while debt restructuring may look as if it made NIS a lot weaker, that is not the case, because the same group who would have been called upon to make higher contributions would have been called upon to pay higher taxes. So it's really a net wash for the most part for Barbados. And as we'll see later on, the change in the debt restructuring only had a 3-year effect on the year that the NIS fund would have been projected to be depleted had debt restructuring not occurred. And I'll discuss that a little later. COVID-19, we all know in 2020, affected labor, and therefore contribution income was down. No benefits on the National Insurance Fund were affected. All of the increase in benefits were on the unemployment fund, which paid out over $150 million in the year and a half during COVID. That fund is back on good footing. Money was borrowed from the National Insurance Fund to be repaid, and also government will be recapitalizing that fund over a period of 3 years. Self-employed, we mentioned, we know there's a growing group of informal sector workers. We see them as on the vendors, we see them in different walks of life. Some of them we see, some of them we don't see. Many of them are working from home on their laptops and providing services both locally and internationally. And again, we're only capturing 1 of every 8. It's a challenge for the fund because the base is shrinking, but also a challenge for them because they won't have a pension when it's their turn to retire and stop earning from their jobs. And finally, the NIS as an organization has faced some challenges in the last few years with their systems and their delivery of service, and also the ability to produce annual audit statements on time. Like the actuarial review that's due every 3 years, every year the NIS is supposed to produce financial statements and annual reports to the minister, who in turn will lay them in Parliament. These are delayed, and the good news is that there's work been done to get these completed soon and tabled in Parliament soon as well. So when we look at the fund and the outlook for the population and the National Insurance Fund, what we see here is that we expect the population to decline each year going forward. As I mentioned a while ago, there are already more deaths than births. We see no reason to assume anything different. Migration is a possibility. If the government wishes to embark on programs to encourage migrants to come to Barbados, whether they be Barbadians who previously migrated, descendants of Barbadians, or foreign investments to increase the labor force and improve employment levels, that's a possibility. But on the current outlook, we are saying that every year there'll be a decrease. But the main challenge for the fund, what we see here, is an aging population. The blue section at the bottom, number of children, is decreasing each year, while the number at the top, the older persons, the pension age persons, is growing. However, the working population is shrinking. So if you think about a family with, say, 6 children, and let's say the parents have no reliable source of income other than the children to take care of them, it's not too difficult for 6 children to take care of mommy and daddy. Some of them bring food, one pay the cable bill, one pay light, telephone, and so on. When you only have 2 children, or you only have 1 child, as family sizes have come down, it becomes a lot more difficult for that one child, 2 children to take care of mommy and daddy. And the same is true for the National Insurance Fund, and the same is true for the government of Barbados, where taxpayers, essentially for the most part those who are actively employed, are expected to pay taxes to the government or pay contributions to NIS in order to help meet the obligations of paying benefits. And so the outlook for the fund now is that depletion of the fund could be as soon as 12 years from now, in 2034, on a pessimistic outlook, but on a more optimistic outlook, it could be in 2041. So if we think about only 12 years, 12 years ago was 2010. So in the next 12 to 15 years, we're looking at the fund being really challenged in a crisis position. And a fund being depleted does not mean that NIS will no longer exist. It just means that NIS will need to find additional funds because there's no longer any savings on which you can deplete to meet your benefits. The chart on the right shows that the contribution rate in orange of 18%, we assume going forward at that level, is much lower than the projected cost of benefits, which is already 24%. So even in 2022, we are collecting 18% on average of wages, but we are paying out 24% of insurable wages. That gap has to be filled from somewhere. We look further down the road to 2035, when around the time that the fund will be really challenged, the cost is about 30% of covered wages. So we collect 18, we might pay out 30%, that 12% gap has to be filled from somewhere. And if we look at dollars and cents, right, this chart shows the contribution income in blue, and the dark line on top is total expenditure. The difference between that dark line on top and the blue section is the gap that needs to be filled each year. What we see from 2020 and in 2021 is that investment income, all of it, has been needed to help pay benefits. And the green section, which is the assets, all the savings that we've accumulated over the last 55 years, are now being tapped into and used to help pay benefits. So starting with fixed deposits in the bank, those have been had to call early to help pay benefits. So the fund is actually now going down in size. The challenge when you start dipping into your savings or your reserves is that if you keep doing that, they'll eventually run out. The same is true for a family. When you save for your child's education, you build up your savings until age 18 or 19, and you draw down when they finish university. So in a drawdown stage, if you keep drawing down, you'll eventually end up with nothing left in savings. And that's been forecast here for the mid to late 2030s. And the red section shows the gap that would need to be filled if we have no more funds left. That gap is huge, at over $700 million in 1 year. So from $200 million a year today, it's only 3 times as large a gap that needs to be filled. And there are very few options from which a gap to be filled. And so the challenge right now is to find the most suitable solution to minimize the growth in that gap and find a way to make sure that we make the fund sustainable going forward. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me that based on what you've just seen and based on the current contribution rate and the benefits as they are today, that the fund is certainly not sustainable for many of us in this room, but definitely not for our children and grandchildren. And as I mentioned earlier, NIS promises are long-term, and so younger folks need to have the confidence that the NIS will be there when it's their turn to get. So the question is, how could a $4 billion fund, that's the size of the fund today, just under $4 billion with a B, be unsustainable? And the first reason is demographics, right? Most of us in this room have no control over that. And the fertility rates came down back in the 60s. Families became smaller and smaller. So what we have in the last 18 years from the last pension reform is a reduction in the number of people paying in versus the number who are taking out. So back in 2004, there were 3.6 people paying in for every one pensioner. Now it's 2.4 and shrinking every year. And the outlook is that it will be 1.8 in 2040 and down to 1.7 in 2060. Right? And again, the example I gave earlier about the family size, it becomes more difficult to take care of those who you're trying to support when you have smaller families or smaller generations of contributors. The second point is that we have had no guidelines as to what to do if the actuary projects fund depletion within maybe 20 years or 30 years, or if costs are going too high. Right? There's nothing in the Act that says something has to be done. And so hopefully after this round of discussions, we can find some hard written triggers or some objectives that are going to be there for future governments to look at. So when the actuary comes in, they can say, well, the targets are either met or not met, and if they're not met, there are 2 or 3 things that we have to do to ensure that they're met going forward. And the third thing is kicking the can down the road. Right? As we heard earlier, 2004, there were some reforms that were good, and here we are again, again looking at reforms. The idea is not to kick the can down the road, but to deal with the issue front and center. There is a possibility of making the fund sustainable, and what we have here are the 4 ingredients that we think are critical to making that possible. Number 1 is the economy. Right? We cannot have a strong NIS in a weak Barbados economy. We depend on contributors to pay contributions. We depend on the government of Barbados to pay their interest and to redeem their bonds when they become due. And so the number 1 factor is to ensure that the economy grows, it attracts foreign investment, local investment, we increase the number of jobs, we increase salaries, and we find a way to make Barbados more attractive, right? So that the school leavers stay in Barbados, they work in Barbados, and they help turn the economy over and over. Good design is number 2. And good design here refers to both the national insurance benefits as well as other benefits. So I mentioned self-employed people a while ago. Most of them don't contribute. The NIS was designed 55 years ago for people who were employed. Back then, there were very few people who were self-employed. So the monthly forms and the monthly remittances and the requirement to pay every month a certain amount, that works well for employed people. It does not work well for self-employed persons. Some months they have plenty, and some months they have none. And so we need to find a way to meet them where they are and to have them contribute. We also should ensure that those people who require government permission, a license to either drive their ZR van or to practice as a lawyer or a doctor, all arms of government should be complied with first before those licenses are issued. Right? We should not have people able to conduct their trade with a government permit without having NIS being compliant. And so it would mean that the arms of government would all speak together, and that's where number 3 comes in. Excuse me. Effective and efficient admin systems. Technology has advanced so much in the last 20 years, but even more so in the last 2 years with COVID, And so we have to find a way to ensure that the NIS and other government departments have systems that can speak to one another, they know what's happening across Barbados, and they can ensure that there are no gaps and there are no duplications in whatever programs NIS offers or whatever other programs the government of Barbados offers. Of course, efficiency means also some costs. We have to ensure that it's done in a cost-effective way. And the final ingredient we believe for sustainability is what I like to call honest and responsible government. Some people say good governance. When we say honest and responsible, we mean more than just not being corrupt, right, or not overspending, but it means dealing with challenges as they come up, right? This particular one, the government could delay and say, we're going to leave in 5 more years, but let's see what happens. hopefully things turn around. But now it's front and center. It's a chance for us to look at the objectives, set some objectives, look at the possibilities, and then decide on the best way forward to ensure that we can secure the NIS for generations to come. And, excuse me, we have to balance long-term objectives with short-term objectives, right? We know people are catching hell in some instances in Barbados today, having difficulty making ends meet. And so it's important that we balance the long-term needs of children and grandchildren to those who are struggling today. So this chart shows the options that we have. And if you think about your own family, and you think about the options you have when you have a financial challenge, there are really only two things that you can do. You can either increase how much money comes in, or you can reduce how much money goes out. You could do one or the other, or you could do both. Both usually gets you, closer and quicker to where you want to be. And so for the NIS, the options are limited. Increasing income, of course, we can increase the contribution rate. It's already at 18.25% for the private sector, a little lower in the public sector, already high and a challenge for employers and employees. Investment income could be increased, possibly if we invest differently. The only challenge is that right now, with most of the funds invested in government of Barbados debt that are yielding 8%, it's difficult to get 8% elsewhere. So while we have a challenge, a problem with all of our eggs, or most of the eggs in one small basket, one country, one currency, and one bond, one investment type, we are challenged that it's a good return, but all concentrated in one location. The final option is an injection from government, right? So remember the gap we saw earlier. If we can't fill the gap with contributions, then the next backstop is the government. But we have to remember that the government of Barbados only gets its money from one place, and that's taxpayers. And the biggest taxpaying group are the employers and the individuals who pay NIS contributions. So whether you call it a higher contribution or higher tax that goes towards NIS, it's almost the same people who are going to feel that burden down the road. So that, on the benefit side, there are three main options, and I'll start at the bottom. One is smaller cost of living adjustments. So every year, the NIS looks at inflation and looks at the wage index, and we determine what the adjustment in January will be for pensions. Right? And the idea is to allow the pensioner to maintain their standard of living that they had when they first got their pension. They could buy the same amount of bread and corned beef and sardines that they could have bought the year before. One option could be to have the burden fully shared by the young and the old. So pensioners could get a smaller increase than inflation may justify. For those who are working and looking forward to a pension, the pension could start later. Right? Some now go at 60, most go at 67, maybe become 68. Maybe we eliminate the age 60 opportunity and make the first age 65. Right? So there's some options within that we can look at. The one where we have the most room to look at and consider different options is to make the average new pension smaller. Right? So again, if the objective is to reduce costs over the future, the one way we have to do it is to reduce the average pension that the cohort of people retiring in a certain year receive. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody must get less. I think we have to make sure we remember that. There are ways of reducing the overall average by not having everybody get less. So we have to consider the most vulnerable, the ones at the lower income spectrum, and the minimum pension is that safety net that they now have to ensure that they get that minimum amount every month. So we can look at different structures. As I said, 55 years ago, what we have in place today is a defined benefit structure. Other countries have done reforms well ahead of us. Every country in the world is probably facing the same challenge we are today. Declining fertility rates, and eventually pension reform will have to come. Some have changed to defined contributions, whether it be fully funded or notional. Some have changed to a hybrid approach, some defined benefits, some defined contribution. So there are things that we can look at. We can look at different pillars, right? So in Barbados today, the NIS is that benefit that provides income security for almost everybody who worked. Right? Some countries have a flat benefit for everybody just because they're elderly. Right? And that's their basic pillar of income security that's paid. It could be means tested, maybe residency based, but it's available to everybody and designed to ensure that no one lives in poverty. Right? So we have some options that we've seen other countries look at, and some of them have actually implemented. We could have benefits that are more progressive. So we have higher replacement rates for lower income people and maybe smaller replacement rates for higher income people who may not need NIS as much as the lower income workers do. More targeted benefits as well, exactly determine who actually needs them more, and let's ensure we cover that base before we look to those who need it less. And the other option is to make it more equitable. So some people believe that they should pay in, and they should get back exactly what they put in, right? The system of NIS is one of solidarity. I heard a story today, and apparently about 15, 20 years ago, a young man in Barbados, on his first week on the job, lost both hands. Never contributed, but a pensioner for life. We have people who work for 40 years, they die at age 63, they never claim sickness, there's a man never claim maternity, let's say you have no spouse, no children, you put money in for 40 years, but get back nothing. But that's the nature of social security systems, right? That all of us put in, and when it's our turn to get, the fund is there for us. And so in 2022, we need to find a way to make sure that the problem we have is fixed with a Barbados solution. Not somebody else's solution, but a Barbados solution. And in so doing, we have to come up with some priorities, some principles that are going to guide those efforts for that new solution. Right? And whether it be, we accept that we want to be fair to generations to come. We want to ensure that the cost of contributions doesn't exceed a certain number. Right? We want to ensure that the government will never have to be called upon to inject funds specifically into the NIS. The NIS will be self-sufficient because it's been designed and tweaked well along the way to ensure that government does not have to include that in their budget allocations each year. Right? And I think I'm going to stop with this last one, and that's the informal sector. Right? The trend of increasing informal sector participation is there. It's tough to change that. I don't think we should try and formalize programs or make them more formal. We have to meet them where they are. And I think as a people, if we are committed to ensuring that we want them to participate because we do not want them to be poor in old age, we have to find a way to ensure that they comply and that they contribute regularly. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Osborne. I'd like to invite the Deputy Chairman of the National Insurance Board, Mr. Roland Adams, to address us, please.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you, Derek. When we've given these talks, and we've given a lot of them when we've consulted, as the Prime Minister explained at the start, we found that overwhelmingly the reaction has been, yes, we value the scheme desperately, and we want to do what we can to save it. That it has been identified as a non-partisan issue, and that's been very, very encouraging, because we are talking about changing a system where on the one hand you have beneficiaries that are currently in receipt of pensions. They will be worried, and yet when we speak to BARC, they've indicated their support for the reform, such as the value they placed on the system. And it has been like that down the line, whoever we have spoken to. Now, when we consider this report, I think many people will initially have some I call it sticker shock. But there are a couple of things to underline here. The fund itself at 3.9 billion is nearly 5 times what the current expenditures on benefits are. It's not a fund that's going to fall over. Nobody is going to lose their benefits overnight because of what we're talking about here. We're not kicking the can down the road. We have time to fix this. We are approaching it methodically, inclusive of everybody that we speak to. We want them to participate in it. and we want it to be very thoughtful. One of the things we have found in speaking to people is that although they recognize it's an issue, it's not always clear to them why this issue is there, where it's actually come from. And the last meeting we had on this, I actually asked questions to explain, to show to people why we're here. So I'm going to do that again. I see we have people in the room, at least one who's under 20, and a few who go all the way up. So there were 3 questions, and if you want to answer, go right ahead, or I'll fill in the blanks afterwards. But do you know how old a child who is born today can expect to live? The life expectancy of someone actually born today? Right? I heard someone whisper something over there. Of a Barbadian. Yeah, talking only about Barbadians. Well, it's about 80. It's a little under 80. That's average. Women tend to survive a little bit longer than men, but on average it's about 80. Now, in 1967, when this scheme was put together, the same number was about 67. So there's a progress in life expectancy that has implications for the benefits. People live longer, they draw their benefits longer, and those benefits are fixed. Okay? And the second question related to the number of children that, on average, a woman has today, as compared to 1967. I see fingers going up. 2 signs there, 1 and then 2, average of 1.5. Well, it's about 1.7, a little under 1.7. Do you know what the number was in 1967? Almost. It was just a shade under 4. All right, so as Derek explained, the population is declining, but more important for the purposes of this scheme, the people who contribute to it, the working population, is also declining. So on the one hand, you have an aging population drawing benefits for longer, financed by a shrinking working population. Okay? Now the third thing to consider is that chart, I think it was page 8 or page 7, that showed the average economic growth rates over the last 12 or 15 years. That's the one on the left. If you average that out, and it's hard to do it visually, have a guess at what the economic growth rate, the GDP, has been over that period or thereabouts. It's not a lot, right? There are a lot of negative bars in there. Well, ignoring the pandemic if you want to, but if you take out the outliers, average growth has been about 0.5 to 0.7% over that period. Now in 1967, in that decade, annual average growth was almost 7%. Okay? So add that in there. We had a situation in 1967 which predated what's called a demographic dividend. We had a strong and growing working population contributing to this fund. We didn't have that many retirees, and it was fueled by an economy that was really powering ahead. We don't have any of those at the moment. So I say all of that to say that when we have spoken to different groups, everyone is aware of operational improvements that can and do need to be made. We spoke with the staff at the NIS this morning. They have so much knowledge that we have to harness to global benchmarks of people who do it best. How can we make it fit a Barbadian solution? That we know we can make a lot of progress there. But the fundamental issue here is structural. We can make all the operational improvements we wish, but unless we change something to increase those who are contributing and look potentially at how we can make sure that benefits don't run ahead of our capacity to pay them, we're not going to fix this. Okay? Now, this report, as I mentioned, gives us, there's a chart also showing the time to depletion, and it's 12 to 19 years from now. It is important when we look at this to realize this is not a prediction. This is a timely reminder that if we do nothing, we're going to be in trouble. But we have the chance here collectively, and it's why I started from the top talking about the message and the feedback we've had from all these groups we've spoken to, the desire to fix this. We have collectively a chance to chart the course towards the future that we want with this scheme. Now, this scheme historically has been our safety net. In some ways, it's underwritten. It's literally provided the insurance that if something went wrong, we didn't leave anybody behind. Nobody fell between the gaps. And it's been there whether times have been good times or bad times. And we've just gone through some pretty bad times. And the fund played an important role there in helping people out and ensuring that they weren't absolutely crushed by the economic standstill that COVID brought us to. So to me, the fund is an essential component of who we are, but also it's played its role in the past. One of the examples I gave was the United Nations Human Development Index. I can remember as a university student picking up that publication for the first time, seeing Barbados ranked #1 amongst all developing nations in the world and ahead of some that were considered developed. And first of all, being surprised, I had no idea we were that good compared to the rest of the world. And this has been an essential part of why we were that good. So it is not just something we can say, let's abandon it. It's been a part of who we are and how we got here, and we have to do something, the necessary things to save it. Now, as Derek said, a strong Barbados, and that's a summary of the last paragraph, if you like. A strong Barbados requires a strong NIS. I don't believe, and I don't think any of the groups we've spoken to truly believe when they look at it, that we can have one without the other. So we've already, besides speaking to people, we've already started to make sure that our process, as I mentioned earlier, truly is methodical, thoughtful, and inclusive. We started to look at who can be part of our working groups and our advisory groups, assisting a technical core of people to come up with proposals that we can put to the social partnership and indeed cabinet in due course. And our timeline is very, very tight. We're moving as fast as we can on this, and we hope to have a first set of proposals by the end of the month. And that will go to the PM and go to the cabinet for discussion, and if we have to make adjustments, we'll make them. But we have a chance here to do something that's not just a rescue job, it's really to shape the future going forward. And PM, I'll stop there.
Thank you for that very clear exposition. At this stage, I think all Barbadians know that in these matters, this government has been very clear that we are one nation, and therefore there are decisions that go beyond government alone. And to that extent, the social partnership has been an integral part of who we are. Indeed, Mr. Adams spoke just now about the fact that a strong Barbados needs a strong NIS, and a strong Barbados is premised on a strong social partnership. And to that extent, this government has made it clear on big issues, we reach out to everybody and we reach out early. The government will not shy away from making the decisions, but like with every family, we need to open up and to hear everyone and to let everyone have their position. And while the traditional social partnership is labor and capital, we have also included the representatives of the spiritual community, as well as the representatives of the political entities in the country, as we did in fighting COVID. So this is no new ground. With that, I'd like to invite the head of the private sector agency, Mrs. Tricia Tanis, to be able to share her perspective. And as others share, at the end, I will wrap up. And then before I wrap up, I'll ask Minister Jordan to indicate some of the outreach programs, or Mr. Adams, whichever of the two who is better placed to do it, the outreach programs to ensure that we don't only have the voices of those with whom we have met already, but over the course of the next just basically 3 weeks, we have the voices of all of Barbados, such that all ideas must contend. But I'll ask Mrs. Tanis now to address us. Thank you.
Thank you, PM. First of all, we want to express from the private sector's perspective our appreciation for being involved in the discussion and being engaged and contributing towards what is clearly a call to action. Not a panicked call to action, but certainly a call to action as it relates to the state of our National Insurance Fund. It has not escaped us that we last attempted to implement robust and rigorous reforms circa 9 years ago. I believe Mr. Osborne has already gone through that, and for the sake of not repeating, but we did a few things which at that time we thought would certainly put the fund in good stead, and we mean the broader we, the government of the day. We increased contribution rates, we increased the retirement age, we increased the ceiling of insurable earnings, and sure enough, for about 3 years after that, the fund essentially experienced significant surpluses. But to support what Mr. Osborne has said, clearly the design and structure of the fund is not one that is sustainable, and that was borne out by the fact that by 2011, notwithstanding those reform measures that were taken in 2003, 2006, we were practically back to square one. And then essentially we went into a decades-long recessionary type environment, and that was before COVID, and the rest, as they would say, is history. We therefore endorse the fact that the design of the plan must capture our collective and urgent attention, because it is clear that it is extremely vulnerable in its design, and we would not want to have to pass this way again, and therefore we support the fact that we need to do it right. I can't say the first time, but hopefully we can do it right the second time, or this time, and create a structure, essentially, that now with the benefit of hindsight, we would appreciate what kind of variables we need to factor in to that design to make it far more resilient. I would want to quote Mr. Osborne and re-emphasize this particular phrase: the longer the major reforms are made, the more draconian the reforms. And therefore, we support the government's current thrust to advance this conversation with dispatch. We endorse the fact that as we go about doing this again, we need to set up a dashboard, and I want to recognize my colleague, Mr. Wade, from ECLR, who I believe brought this to at least a social partnership discourse, and I believe it has been taken on board. The fact that we need to design, I would call it trigger points in the structure, such that as the plan develops and grows over time, that there are certain protocols that would flag the fact that we need to sit down at the drawing board again and make iterative changes as we go, and thus avoid the radical conversations such as this one that we're having today. It is clear that the investment the over dependence in contravention of even the fund's stated investment policies needs to be looked at. And in a situation where we have circa 70% of its assets being invested in government paper, certainly created a far more vulnerable situation in 2018 when that debt had to be restructured. But even given that, we've heard that that would only account for 3 of the 12 to 14 years that we have to make up for. But certainly these are the types of things we need to tweak and the best practices that we need to employ as we go forward. From the private sector's perspective, we know that any impact or redesign of the national insurance scheme will have an impact on private pension plans. As the current design goes, we are in lockstep, certainly for those defined benefit schemes and even within defined contribution schemes. The smaller the NIS pension payout, the more dependent the individual will be on the private scheme and vice versa. But we can't really speak to that until we have some sense of what the final recommendations will be. But from the private sector's perspective, we will be monitoring keenly, contributing to, and monitoring any design elements, because they will have a knock-on impact on private sector schemes as well. Finally, before I turn over to my colleagues, we certainly could not rest our comments without enforcing and supporting the need for good governance as we go forward. We are aware that we are potentially transitioning, we will transition. The government has stated its intention to transition to a state-owned enterprise. We would therefore want to see that some of the niggling issues that are affecting the governance as it stands under the current structure are definitely not roll forward into that structure, and that we take the opportunity to draw the proverbial line in the sand and essentially bring those governance issues on seat and to correct them extremely judiciously. Of course, I could not rest my comments without once again making a plug for a look at how we incentivize or re-incentivize the involvement in private pension schemes once more through fiscal incentives or through other means. Because what is clear is that beyond the conversation on national insurance funding is that we need to have a broader national conversation on pension reform as well. And essentially it needs to form part of the financial literacy that we speak of. We need to be able to prepare our population for preparing for this time in their lives. And I think essentially we need to continue to engage at this level. And at this point, I will rest with thanks again for being able to participate here this afternoon.
Thank you very much for those comments, and I can't agree with you more than on the issue of the broader discussion on national pension reform beyond even the NIS as we go forward. I'd like to invite now Mr. Richard Green to speak from the National Union of Public Workers, and then thereafter Ms. Tony Moore.
Well, thank you, Madam PM, for allowing me to give a few remarks on behalf of the NUPW, which I represent. Just for the benefit of the nation and to our members, that the matter of pension reform and revitalization is now a multi-generational one for us. I've been privy and been around long enough to hear my former general secretaries sharing their views on the matter, and they have done that, and they did that in their time, and this is now our time to also make that contribution to the revitalization of our scheme. We sit on the NIS board, and we take our responsibility there very seriously. While we have our constituent interests in public servants, and we do whatever we can to represent those, because the NIS scheme is so intertwined in the life, the quality of life, the standard of life of a public officer. And not only looking at the NIS scheme as a standalone, but the whole social security system. We believe that the specific our interests and the interests of the public officer must be held with some serious import. If I look at my union, the fastest growing division in the NUPW is our retirees division. That is true. It is the fastest growing division. But there are a number of positives about it. It tells us that our members are living longer, they're living healthier, they believe in lifelong membership with the union, they participate, they're engaged. What our members need is a reliable, a sustainable and a stable NAS fund, and a total, and that being part of the total Social Security platform. Our beneficiaries need to feel confident that in their time of need, the NIS will be there for them and be there for their children as well. So we support the sustainable development of the society and the economy to make this economy stronger, to make the NIS stronger, and of course, for greater prosperity and security for our constituents and the society as a whole. We want to see an NIS that meets the expectations of the present and the future generations, and maintaining the Bajan way of life and the quality of life that we've come to enjoy and to expect. Of course, we will put what we consider measures that we think can assist in making the transition that much easier. And of course, we're going to be looking at options based on flexibility, whether it's compulsory or voluntary options, but making sure, and I want to make it very, very clear, that we make sure that we support full compliance of all persons who should be contributing to the fund. And of course, we'll be doing our utmost, because we have recognized within our union that the whole concept of retirement has to change. Too many times we hear people talking about, I'm going to get my pension and go home and relax. That will not apply for many of us anymore. There needs to be a comprehensive review of what we consider retirement, because we don't want our members, we don't want our constituents to go away with having a result of a lower expectation when they reach that time of retirement, whatever it is then. So I just want to pledge from our end, the National Union of Public Workers, that we will continue to support the efforts to make this scheme a viable one, and to give as much support to all efforts and all the stakeholders to make sure that we have a plan that is worthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Moore?
Thank you. Everyone in the room, I believe by now, has acknowledged and recognized that Barbados has enjoyed a long tradition of national insurance, therefore a long tradition of social protection. The national insurance is almost as old as this country is independent, being formed just within a year of independence. And the fact that we are discussing this and the need for reform, and as my counterpart in the private sector has said again, and the fact that we are in a crisis and have to be considering reform to the national insurance as a whole is not anything that should strike us as peculiar, because indeed in this country our history has shown us that times of crises have laid bare and emphasized the need for changes to be made. It was in the early 1980s, around 81, that the crisis of that time caused us to recognize the need for amendments to the national insurance in the form of an unemployment insurance that the BWU advocated for, along with other unions, in the same way that we had advocated for workmen's compensation. So the fact that we are in crisis where there may be the consideration by many, there are many other immediate issues that we should be concerned with. It is remarkable for us that our country is one that is exemplar, not waiting until a situation inflates out of our control, where the responses are not responses that we can shape, but we are taking action to ensure that changes can be implemented and be graduated in a way that the equity that everyone has spoken about that is so necessary now is achieved. The presentations that we have received shows, for instance, that if action is not taken, well, we are hearing that the fund will not fold up now, but it means that people like me, though, compromise, because at the tender age of 46, I'm hearing almost, that'll be Friday for all those who want to bring gifts, but hearing that the possibility exists that a fund and all its benefits might not extend to people who are 55 and less, that places me and places anybody of that age in a position where we have to consider the urgency of it. I remember when the previous reforms were being discussed, I heard about them. I heard about the possibility of an age even extending up to 70. I never saw myself in that reality. Today, the situation is different. So it means that it becomes urgent and important enough, not only for retirees or for those approaching retirement, but for people in work, and indeed for those potentials to the job market, to consider the decisions that we are making today that ultimately will shape the lives of all of us. Whether it is that we expect that we are, if we take pension, or will be at pensionable age soon or not, we have our parents who we want to ensure can get a pension after contributing into a system so that we don't have to support them, for instance, but also that they can maintain their independence. So there are multifaceted considerations that must be made. As we have heard, there is a need for the system to be able to have the intergenerational equity. We don't want to be paying into a system for those like myself that have been paying for the last 25 years or so and know that I can't get benefits in the same way that my mother, my grandmother, and so on has benefited. And of course, we need to focus on good design at the same time that we have to be working on building a strong economy, that all of the objectives we want can be achieved. And this is not only about maintaining the current system of benefits, but it is about expanding benefits and even enhancing benefits. Workers want paternity leave, they want parental leave, but if we are struggling to ensure that in 20 years we can sustain existing benefits, how then is it possible that we can reasonably expect to expand on benefits unless we get our economy going and the NIS system reformed in a way that it is sustainable and equitable and affordable for all of us? So the Barbados Workers Union has met at the level of its executive council, and we thank the actuary, Mr. Osborne, for affording us the opportunity to meet and engage. And we look forward to having him again at our annual conference on the last Saturday, the midterm conference, which takes place the last Saturday of this month. But that is not to say that we are not encouraging individual members of the union and workers generally to weigh in and take every opportunity over the next 3 weeks to express your concerns, and more so, your expectations and recommendations of how we can treat to this, so that as we look to see how we can sustain our system of social security and therefore more widely our system of social protection, we're then in a position to have the broadest possible view of what the public thinks, what it expects, and consider therefore what is in the best interest of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite the President of the Democratic Labour Party, Mr. Ronnie Yearwood, to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank the government for inviting the Democratic Labour Party to this press briefing. I truly believe that as we move forward, we need proper consultation on pensions and the National Insurance Scheme. Having only seen the presentation, not the full report, I will obviously only offer some initial comments at this stage. As you would appreciate, this is too important of an issue not to have full discussion, and I will have to return to my membership where we can have full discussion on this report, because that's the way we do things, and I don't want to put Mr. Osborne on the spot, but I would publicly invite him when he's ready to attend to present and speak to our membership, and we can have that discussion with the party as well, because I believe policy has to be made with inputs from the people it should affect. So on that note, I think one of the things that we're going to have to do, and one of the things the government will have to do, is to simply ask Barbadians what type of pensions and what do they want their retirement to look like. The reality is work is changing, and years ago actually in this room, if not in this very building, I spoke about the changing nature of work and what we're going to have to do as we move forward. The fact is retirement for my generation will not be anything like what it was for my grandmother and my grandfather. And secondly, the NIS was set up, as we all understand, by Barrow. And in some ways, it has worked well for some Barbadians. And the reality is worked well enough that some Barbadians may not need the National Insurance Scheme. And it means that that universal one-size-fits NIS approach may have to go. We have to look to introduce opt-outs and optionalities. The reality is we have to really examine everything and put everything on the table as we seek to reform the National Insurance Scheme, while at the same time protecting what we call a persistent pool of people who may need the National Insurance Scheme. Really, at the end of it all, and when we think about reforming the NIS, it is about how do we do it in a way that is good for all Barbadians, one that protects those at the most vulnerable end. And at the same point, we have to recognize, I think, that we have to reform tax and welfare. And I don't see how we can do one on its own. I think really we're going to have to juggle a lot here, and it's going to demand this national conversation. And that's why I'm glad we're all here, because this is going to be some serious heavy lifting. And the Democratic Labour Party, as always, stands ready to be part of structured, responsible discussions on how we move this country forward. Obviously, we're going to have differences. We're not going to agree on everything, but we are here to do what we think is best for Barbadians. And I want people to understand, and I want people to know that. And as I said, Mr. Osborne, you are fully invited to attend George Street at any time so that you can engage with our membership and they can engage with you, and we can find a way forward from our party's perspective, and one that we can share into what the national perspectives will be. So I just want to say that and to thank the government for this initial conversation with us and with the people of Barbados.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yearwood. Let me thank everyone who has spoken, and to indicate that, as I said earlier, the level of consultation has been much broader than what you've seen thus far. But the time has come for us now to involve the entire family, the entire Barbadian public. And there are a couple of things that I'd like to reinforce at the outset. One, we are not in crisis, but we want to avoid a crisis 15 years from now. That is therefore going to mean that those of us who have the responsibility for taking decisions can do so at the earliest possible opportunity. There are countries in the Caribbean that are 5-6 years away from the moment that we are talking about. We don't want that to happen to us, because if that happens to us, it means, like with everything, and we know it in terms of medical decisions in our own lives, the longer we leave something to fix it, the more we are at risk of it being fatal to us. Whether it is diabetes and cutting off a toe as opposed to a foot from the knee down, or worse still, sepsis in this blood system. So early, timely intervention is critical. Secondly, that this is about the country. It's not about the government. It's not about any party. It's not even about the NIS alone as an institution. It is about the people of Barbados. And to that extent, a strong Barbados, as you heard, requires a strong system of solidarity. And the National Insurance Scheme is for us that system of solidarity. It is ironic, and most Barbadians will not know this, but you heard Mr. Osborne say so at the beginning, that it was the International Labour Organization that came through the region in the 1960s and that did the work to prepare our individual countries to put systems in place for Social Security. We may think that we are worse off than most, but we're not. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to take timely action. The United States of America has a situation where their government is literally contributing every single year to keeping their Social Security system afloat. And the numbers for that is about 0.7% of GDP. If I were to equate that to Barbados, it would mean that we would be putting in, at the moment, about $75 million a year in order to keep the National Insurance Scheme afloat. We are not doing that, nor are we there. And we don't want ever to be there, hence these early discussions. By extension, I want to reinforce that the National Insurance Scheme is in a position to satisfy all claims that are made legitimately on it today. And therefore, this meeting, these conversations have nothing at all to do with it. But all of us know that you want to make sure that if ever there are rainy days again, and God knows that we just went through a series of rainy days with this COVID-19 pandemic, and had the National Insurance Scheme not been there to get tens of thousands of Barbadian families through this moment that we were going through, God knows where we would be today. So I want us to say that we could not want to have this discussion against a better background than the last few years. And to that extent, those of us, especially those of you with children, need to understand, or those of us who are under the age of 55 or 50, depending, because there's no exact science, as Mr. Osborne said, but as you heard from the General Secretary, those who are younger really have to contemplate how and what we're going to do. Mrs. Tannis made it clear, and I echoed her remarks, that Barbados needs to address reform generally of pensions and not just of the National Insurance Scheme. As you know, in March of this year, the government took the decision to also address the issue of pensions in the public service. And while it is never easy to deliver news of reform, the reality is that if we want to make sure that we don't topple over as a country and as a government, then we need to make these decisions, and we have done so in a way that we believe to be least harmful and least hurtful, because it relates to new people coming in and not adjustments to existing population. I want to ask Mr. Osborne to bring back up a slide for us, please, because when we see those numbers, we will better understand why I am where we are. And we'll go back to the one before, please. I want the whole of Barbados to see this slide, because the line going across in black, or navy blue, is Barbados. In 1950, Barbados had just over 200,000 people. Bahamas and Belize had less than 100,000 people. In fact, I think they were around 80,000, both of them. Today, as we speak, Barbados is struggling to get to 290,000, and Bahamas and Belize both have over 400,000 people. And you can see that by reason of the arc of the graph. Now, it is true that the Barbados Family Planning Association started in the 1950s, and it is also true that the Barbados Family Planning Association has excelled in being able to have that kind of impact in terms of family planning going forward, as we did as an independent nation. In addition, you heard from Mr. Adams that what was a life expectancy of 67 years old in 1967, in the year 2022, 55 years after being independent, is now a life expectancy of effectively 80 years old. So the average Bajan is going to expect to live 13 years more than they did at the start of independence. That is a sign of progress, yes, but there are consequences. Thirdly, child mortality has also dropped significantly over the years, and therefore there are more of our kids living, there are more of our kids healthy. Bottom line is, what we therefore see is, but equally, Bajans are having less children, and I have to confess that I haven't helped to solve the problem, and there are others in this room who certainly were not solving it at the 4 children per person that we were seeing in 19. I'm not looking to my left at all. But the point is that and Dr. Yerd, you would appreciate this. You understand? Because the replacement rate is 2.1 technically. Obviously, you can't have 2.1 children. So you're really talking about 3 children, 2 to 3 children. And even if we want to have a policy now, which as we should, the reality is it's going to still take 20 to 25 to 30 years for that to have a meaningful impact on us. I'd like him to go to the next slide, and this drives home the point even more. The top 2 lines show 2007 and 2008. And in 2008, Barbados had 128,204 contributors to the NIS scheme. 128,204 contributors. That was perhaps at its height. It was anticipated in the actuarial reports around then that in this year, 2022, that we would have 137,000 people. Regrettably, look at where we are at the bottom of the screen. We now have, for sure, at the end of last year, 105,585, with a further projected decline to 104,000. So we are effectively 33,000 short of where we wanted to be, or we anticipated that we would be. Now, if we go back to the slide that looks at what the options are, and that one there, thank you, go back. We see now that in terms of increased income, there are 3 options, and Mr. Osborne, I'd like to suggest a 4th, for completeness' sake.
Tell me.
That is the number of contributors. So that, yes, a higher contribution rate, because if you're paying more rate with the same number of people, you'll get more money. But that has limits too, because people have to live, people have to pay mortgages, people have to do all kinds of things. And I have used the phrase in Barbados since assuming this office that perhaps the little children more than anybody else come and tell me about. Many hands make light work. And one of the things that we are clearly seeing is that that number of contributors has significantly dropped. Ronald, if you do the numbers for me, 33,000 times 620 comes up to how much?
201 million.
So roughly $200 million more a year would have been being taken in had we had those numbers with respect to contributors. And I say that because that's not the only variable. Of course, growth rate and other things matter as well, and expenditure and benefits. But I make those points to make the fact that this country can no longer hide from the fact that we also have a declining population that is an aging population and a declining workforce. And the 3 things can literally undermine the stability and the security, not just of the national insurance scheme, but of the state of Barbados. And therefore, this discussion is timely. There is also coming before Parliament, and Cabinet shortly, the National Commission on Population's report. We set up a National Commission on Population when coming to office. Once Cabinet reviews that in the next week or two, that will also be made available to all of the social partners. And Dr. Yearwood, obviously, I would more than happy to ask Mr. Osborne to stay on or to come back and to address the members of the Democratic Labour Party, as I'm sure that we will also do with other institutions. I've heard the Barbados Workers Union also make the same point, and the Barbados Labour Party and others will also be doing the same thing. This is a time for family conversation. And the family conversation means that as we go forward, people will have views, and all views must contend. Some may be those that people have said already, and there's some, we know that the problems are structural, but there is still a valid place for talking about compliance. There's still a valid place for talking about accountability. With respect to the issue of the annual accounts, part of the difficulty has been the discrepancy between cash and accrual and what that has meant in terms of revenue. And I believe that the board, through its representative, have had discussions recently with the Auditor General, and I look forward to the board and the Auditor General being able to release to the country whether that issue has been resolved and to what extent, therefore, we can look forward to those annual accounts being laid in Parliament, as has been my desire and requirement since coming to this office. Bottom line also is, however, that when we finish looking at all of those other things, including the options for rates and later pension ages and all of those things, we're back at a structural issue. And we have, therefore, to look at that, and we have to look at what will bring a strong Barbados, a strong Barbadian economy. And that means, one, perhaps looking at the fact that we have to stem the tide of a declining workforce and a declining population. Perhaps the worst statistic that I've received in office since being here is the fact that in 2050, 1 in every 2 Barbadians, according to ECLAC, will be over the age of 65 years old. That is untenable. It is unsustainable. And it's not that I have a problem with it, because I'm going to be one of those who will be over 65. And I suspect a lot of people at this table too, including you, Dr. Yearwood. So that those things will happen. But we have to do something about it now, because simply having children will not be able to close that gap in the next 22, 25, 27 years. And therefore, those conversations must take place as well now. In addition to that, we have to come to grips with the reality that what must we do to increase our productivity? If this economy is to grow, then it means that each of us got to carry a little more weight and to work a little harder in order to be able to grow the economy. And I've been very clear about the principles, just as the NIS has principles that it will share with the public. I've been very clear that there's one major principle that should always drive us, and that is share the burden, share the bounty. And I would like to think that that principle is as sacred as friends of all, satellites of none, and it is as sacred as the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I don't believe deviating far from those principles and deviating far from those principles. I feel strongly that if we hold to them, we will get through these moments. And as I said, this is not a crisis, but it is a challenge, and we know how to rise to the challenge as Barbadian people. I'd like us to also remember that going forward, it is also going to mean 1 in every 8 people who are self-employed now contribute to the scheme, according to the information given to me by the actuary. We need more. And self-employed persons learned that because during the COVID pandemic, we had to introduce a business interruption benefit that did not exist before. And we did that in order to ensure that people who are self-employed, whether they're taxi drivers, whether they're vendors, shop owners, whatever, that they were in a position still to be able to live. And we therefore need to have a different communication campaign. The NIS accepts that they also have to change up how they accept benefits from people and why. A lot of self-employed people engage in seasonal income. So therefore, they're not in a position to come, and don't give me a form, because the first thing a form does is to make my head hurt. So tell me how much I can put in and what that can give me. If I put in A, I can get Y. If I put in B, I can get C. If I put in Z, I can get AA squared. Tell us and just let people pick, just like how they go and pick on a menu. You go in a restaurant, I want that, I want this, I want that. This is what I can pay for. And the ability to take lump sum payments periodically must be a feature of the scheme. There is too much access to technology now as well for us not to be processing more efficiently claims from persons. But I also want to make another point with respect to how we use the benefits. And not that this is one of the major problems alone, but just as there needs to be greater compliance, particularly among self-employed persons and employers and employees generally, there needs also to be a recognition that if we are going to go forward, then we need to start selling to each other the benefits of the NIS. A wife living with a husband needs to make sure that the husband's NIS benefits are being paid if she expects to draw the maternity leave, the two of them together, if she's not working. There are people, for example, who may feel that it is okay to live out good now, but look at outside. The whole of this week the rain falling. The whole of this week the rain falling. And we live in a world now that is so globally uncertain that we need the umbrella of the NIS to keep us in there. So over the course of the next few weeks, my friends, we will have to have some conversations. You know, I joked with the others and said that as we look at the fact that we're getting older and we're healthier, our responsibility as a government is also to make sure that Barbadians are healthier as they get older. And that is critical. I've spoken over and over about the fact that diabetes is at epidemic proportions. It has to change. We have to wrestle it down to the ground. And I've asked the Ministry of Health to ensure that there can be regular testing, parish by parish by parish, both in terms of hypertension, but also in terms of diabetes, because the quicker you know your status, the easier it is for you to correct it. What gets measured gets done. Similarly, if the new 40 is now 50, and people tell you that and joke all the time, then, or the new 50 is now 40, however which you want to look at it. It depends on how you want to look at the glass. But the important thing is that people at 50 doing what they used to do at 40. And people at 70 doing what they used to do at 60. And people at 80 doing what they used to do at 70. The point is that we have all benefited from improvements in medical science, but improvements also in quality of life. And therefore, we can't expect for all of these other metrics to change. That Barbadians are living longer to 80, that we're having less children, we've reduced child mortality, we've also, in many instances, seen what it is to have a declining population. And for me, my first inkling on this was checking 11 plus numbers. And ironically, the 11 plus was yesterday. Because that gave us an idea. When I was Minister of Education, the numbers of persons taking the 11 plus were just over 4,000. Yesterday, I think we did good to reach 3,200. It is real. I'm going to ask Minister Jordan to just share with us the opportunities for Barbadians to get fully engaged in this conversation in the next 3 weeks. This is our country. This is our future. And I'm asking Barbadians to step up to the plate and let us hear what people feel and the combinations and permutations that may well be there in terms of pensions and pension age, in terms of amount, in terms of contribution rates, in terms of having more people contributing to general compliance, in terms of looking at population issues. So whatever it is, let us put all issues out there and let us have that family conversation. And Ronnie, I want to say to you that on the issues of tax and on welfare, I think it is more welfare issues, we are more than happy, and we are in the middle, as you know, of the restructuring of the Ministry of People Empowerment. Our welfare system goes back, regrettably, to almost Victorian age, and if ever there was a time for us as a nation to get it right, it is now. That don't mean that we ain't gonna fight on other issues, but you and I have a responsibility now, along with Bishop Atherley, on the issues that go beyond our partisan political divide, to fix this country on education reform, on welfare reform, on criminal justice reform, on national insurance, social security reform. And if the Democratic Labour Party is up to it, then I say in the presence of Barbados and the world that we're up to it with you, because I believe that as children of independence, we have a responsibility to those who helped build this country before us, and who invested heavily in us, to make sure that those who come have the best possible chance as Barbadians of surviving. Minister Jordan.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And against the backdrop of trying to engage as many Barbadians as possible, all Barbadians we hope would want to participate with this. We have already established an email address that you can begin to share your reflections, suggestions on. That email address is suggestions@bginis.gov.bb, suggestions@bginis.gov.bb. So that email address is available. By Monday, we will be having a suggestion box in every parish. By Monday, we should have about half of those boxes placed, and soon thereafter, we'll have the others placed. We are intending to use post offices because they are scattered across the country and are accessible by most persons. We also intend to have some town hall meetings, even though there is the room for placing suggestions. We understand that Barbadians like still to have some opportunities to engage on a face-to-face basis. And so we intend to have about 3 town hall meetings, one at the center, so the St. Michael area, one in the east, and one in the north. And so we're going to have those town hall meetings. The dates of the town hall meetings will be communicated to the country once we have firmed up those dates and locations. We are also having, and this is, I'm saying it to the country, but we've already said it to the staff at the NIS, we value our staff and we value their experience and the contribution that they can make. And so along with the suggestions that they have already made to us in our face-to-face meeting earlier today, we are having a special suggestion box for them to be able to share, and that's going to be at the Frank Walcott building. They're going to be able to share their own contributions. Beside those, we've said to the stakeholder groups that we've already met with, that is to say the private sector, the trades union, Barbados Workers Union, C2SAB, NUPW, and Unity. We've met with all faith-based organizations. We met with political parties, as you know. We met with former ministers, former chairs and directors of the National Insurance Board. We've shared with independent senators, and we've also shared with BARP, and we have indicated to all of those stakeholder groups that we are available to receive written submissions so that they have had the opportunity already to share orally, but they also have the facility to share their own written submissions as well. So, Prime Minister, those are the opportunities that we have that will cover the entire country, and I just joined with Prime Minister to ask Barbadians to participate. This is our social security system. It is to ensure that we can benefit. It is to ensure that our children can benefit. It is to ensure that our grandchildren can benefit. We can do it together. We need to hear from you, and we will facilitate that engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just ask if there are any questions from anyone, including those who are not necessarily of the media, before we close. But as you can see, there's going to be a lot of opportunities in the next 3 weeks for that kind of conversation to allow all ideas to contend. But if there's anyone else before we close off, I think we have had 90 minutes of a lot of food for thought. You wanted to ask? Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all Barbadians for engaging with us, those who are listening live and those who will listen after. And I look forward, as I said, to us having a rich family discussion. But at the end of it, we shall govern and we shall prepare for the future. Thank you, and God bless this nation. God bless you all.